Josephine Raye buried an empty grave and lived with the lie until the day she rode into Dust Hollow and saw her dead son wearing a badge, calling the man who stole him Pa. Dust swirled around Josephine Raye's worn boots as she guided her horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Betsy, into the town of Redemption. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. Redemption held nothing for her, only the bitter echo of a life stolen. 15 years. 15 years since they'd told her the babe was stillborn, a mercy after her difficulties. She squinted, the harsh sun reflecting off the false fronts of the buildings. The air was thick with the smells of dust, horses, and something else, fear. Josephine ignored the stares of the townsfolk. Their judgment meant nothing. Her eyes scanned the streets, searching. She was a woman carved from granite, her face etched with hardship, her gaze holding the cold determination of a hunter. But behind that hardened exterior was a mother's heart, broken and yearning. She was here to reclaim what was hers, no matter the cost. A young man, barely more than a boy, stepped out of the sheriff's office. He wore a deputy's badge pinned to his chest, the metal gleaming in the sun. He had the sheriff's jawline, but his eyes, they were the color of the summer sky after a storm, a familiar blue that struck Josephine like a physical blow. He was taller than she expected, lean, but with a wiry strength evident in his stance. He noticed her staring and his brow furrowed. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice still carrying the high pitch of youth, though he tried to deepen it. Josephine's breath caught. 15 years melted away. It was him, grown but undeniably her own. She forced herself to speak, her voice rough, just passing through, deputy, admiring the scenery. She forced a tight smile, trying to mask the tidal wave of emotion threatening to drown her. The deputy, whose name she would soon learn was Billy, seemed eager to prove himself. He stood a little straighter, puffing out his chest. He was clean-shaven, his hair neatly combed, an unusual sight in this rough-and-tumble town. It spoke volumes about the sheriff's influence. Redemption wasn't a place where people thrived. They merely existed, their lives dictated by the whims of the man in charge. Josephine watched as a group of men hurried past, their eyes downcast, avoiding contact. A woman selling apples from a rickety cart flinched as Billy walked by, offering a nervous smile. The air crackled with unspoken rules, with a fear that hung heavier than the dust. This wasn't just a town, it was a cage, and the sheriff held the key. Billy, in his youthful innocence, seemed blind to it all, a pawn in a much larger, crueler game. The door to the sheriff's office darkened. A large figure filled the frame, blocking out the light. Sheriff Thorne. He was bigger than Josephine remembered, his face a roadmap of hard living and cruelty, his eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on her. The air instantly grew thick, heavy with unspoken animosity. Billy, sensing the shift in atmosphere, stepped back, his hand instinctively moving towards his gun. Thorne ignored him, his gaze never leaving Josephine. "Josephine," he said, his voice a low growl, "didn't think I'd see you darken my doorstep again. It wasn't a question, it was a threat. He knew why she was here. He'd always known she'd come back." Josephine met his stare, unflinching. "I had some unfinished business, Thorne." The words hung in the air, a promise of pain to come, a flicker of memory. Josephine, younger, defiant, chained to a bed in a makeshift infirmary, the air thick with the stench of sickness and despair. Thorne, standing over her, his face a mask of cold indifference. "It's for the best, Josephine," he'd said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The baby was weak, didn't make it." Lies, all lies. She remembered the pain, the fight, the brief moment of holding her son before they ripped him away. She remembered the emptiness that followed, a void that had haunted her for 15 years. The flashback ended as quickly as it began, leaving her breathless and trembling with renewed fury. She focused on Thorne, the present-day Thorne, the man who had stolen her life. He would pay. He would pay for everything, but Billy, the boy, her son. He stood between her and Thorne, an innocent shield. Could she truly unleash her vengeance, knowing it would shatter his world? He believed Thorne was his father. He seemed happy. Was his happiness worth sacrificing for the truth? The questions clawed at her, tearing at the edges of her resolve. She had come for revenge, for justice, but now, faced with the reality of her son's life, she hesitated. Exposing Thorne would destroy everything Billy knew, potentially leaving him with nothing. Could she live with that? Could she live with the lie? The internal battle raged, a war between a mother's love and a burning desire for retribution. The choice was hers, and it was tearing her apart. That night, Josephine found a room at the dilapidated hotel. Sleep offered no escape, only a restless torment of what-ifs. The next morning, she decided to observe Billy more closely. She watched him from a distance, helping an elderly woman carry groceries, mediating a dispute between two drunk cowboys, even gently scolding a stray dog. He was kind, genuine, everything Thorne was not. She learned his routines, his habits, the people he interacted with. She discovered he was well-liked, respected, despite the sheriff's shadow looming over him. This information became her compass. If she was going to make a decision about his future, she needed to know who he truly was, separate from the man who raised him. Every observation added another layer to her agonizing dilemma. Was this a life worth saving, even if it was built on a foundation of lies? One afternoon, Josephine saw Thorne publicly berating Billy for being too soft on a petty thief. Thorne's words were harsh, demeaning, and Billy visibly flinched, his face flushing red. Yet, instead of arguing back, Billy simply lowered his head, absorbing the abuse. But then, as Thorne turned away, Billy offered the thief a piece of bread and a quiet word of encouragement before leading him to the jail. It was a small act of defiance, almost imperceptible, but Josephine saw it. A spark of goodness, a rebellion against Thorne's callousness. It was a glimmer of hope, a sign that Billy wasn't entirely lost, that beneath the sheriff's influence his true self still flickered. Perhaps, just perhaps, the truth wouldn't destroy him. Perhaps it would set him free. Thorne wasn't stupid. He noticed Josephine's constant presence, her watchful eyes. He started patrolling the streets more frequently, his gaze lingering on her, a silent warning. He increased Billy's workload, keeping him close, away from Josephine's potential influence. One evening, as Josephine was leaving the saloon, Thorne blocked her path. "You're causing trouble, Josephine," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Trouble I won't tolerate." She met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm just passing through, Thorne. Don't let my presence bother you so much." "This town is under my protection," he growled, "and I protect what's mine." He paused, his eyes flicking towards the sheriff's office where Billy was visible through the window doing paperwork. "Everything that's mine." The threat was clear. He knew she was after Billy and he wouldn't let her get close. The game had escalated. Josephine knew she had to be smarter, more careful. She couldn't risk alerting Thorne further. She started focusing her efforts on gathering information from the townsfolk, subtly probing about Billy's past, his upbringing. Most were too afraid to speak openly, but a few, fueled by resentment towards Thorne, offered cryptic clues. One old woman, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pity, whispered, "He came here, sudden-like." Thorne never spoke of a mother. Another hinted at a locked box Thorne kept hidden in his office. The pieces were slowly coming together, confirming her suspicions. Then one rainy afternoon, while Thorne was out of town, Josephine saw her opportunity. She slipped into the sheriff's office, her heart pounding, determined to find proof, solid evidence to confirm what she already knew in her heart. The locked box was her target. The lock on the box was simple, easily picked with a hairpin. Inside, nestled amongst old letters and faded photographs, was a birth certificate. William Raye, born 15 years ago in the mining town of Blackwood. Her name was listed as the mother. Thorne's name was nowhere to be found. Beneath the certificate was a yellowed newspaper clipping detailing Josephine's untimely demise after a bout of illness. The lies were blatant, undeniable. Thorne had meticulously constructed a false narrative, erasing her from history, stealing her son, and raising him as his own. A wave of fury washed over her, eclipsing the doubt and hesitation. He hadn't just lied, he had orchestrated a cruel, calculated theft. The evidence was irrefutable. He would pay. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming her son, about setting the record straight, about righting a 15-year-old wrong. Her resolve hardened into steel. Josephine left the sheriff's office, the rain mirroring the storm raging within her. She had the proof, the undeniable truth. But now what? Could she really waltz in and tell Billy his entire life was a lie? Could she be the one to shatter his world, even if it was built on a foundation of deception? The kind, earnest young man she'd observed, would he forgive her for waiting so long, for not being there? Or would he resent her for destroying the only family he'd ever known? She found herself back at the hotel, pacing the worn floorboards. The birth certificate and newspaper clipping lay on the table, mocking her indecision. She knew what Thorne deserved, but what did Billy deserve? The weight of the choice pressed down on her, suffocating her. It was a choice between vengeance and compassion, between truth and protection, and Josephine felt utterly lost. She had to decide, and she had to decide soon. Thorn would be back. She found Thorn in the saloon, nursing a whiskey, his eyes hard and watchful. He saw her approach, and a cruel smile twisted his lips. "Looking for something, Josephine?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "Answers, Thorn," she replied, her voice low but firm. "And justice." She placed the birth certificate and newspaper clipping on the table, the yellowed paper stark against the dark wood. Thorn's eyes narrowed, but he didn't flinch. "Old news," he said, his hand instinctively moving towards his gun. "Water under the bridge." "You stole my son, Thorn," Josephine accused, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "You lied to him, to everyone." "He's better off with me," Thorn sneered. "You were nothing but trouble." "He's my son," Josephine roared, drawing the attention of everyone in the saloon, "and I'm here to take him back." The gauntlet had been thrown. Billy, drawn by the commotion, had entered the saloon unnoticed. He stood frozen near the entrance, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He'd only caught the tail end of the argument, Josephine's desperate cry, "He's my son," and Thorn's dismissive sneer. He looked from Josephine to Thorn, confusion warring with dawning horror. He saw the birth certificate on the table, the newspaper clipping, and his hand trembled as he reached for them. Thorn lunged, trying to stop him, but Billy was too quick. He snatched the documents, his eyes scanning the words, his breath catching in his throat. The saloon fell silent, all eyes on Billy as the truth began to dawn. The world he knew, the life he'd lived, was crumbling before his very eyes. He looked at Thorn, his face a mask of betrayal. What is this?" He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The seed of doubt had been planted. Thorn's face hardened. He no longer bothered with lies or denials. "He was a mistake, a burden," he spat, his eyes filled with a coldness that chilled Billy to the bone. "I did what was necessary." The words were a knife twisting in Billy's heart. He'd idolized Thorn, seen him as a strong, righteous father figure. Now he saw the truth, a manipulative, cruel man who had stolen his life and built it on lies. The betrayal was absolute, shattering his perception of everything he thought he knew. You lied to me," Billy whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Thorn simply shrugged, his indifference a final, devastating blow. "Don't be a fool, boy, you wouldn't be anything without me." The mask had fallen, revealing the monster beneath. Billy's world had crumbled. The only question now was what he would do with the ruins. Josephine stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and fierce protectiveness. She reached out to Billy, her hand hovering hesitantly. "Billy," she said softly, her voice filled with a warmth he'd never heard before. "It's true, I am your mother." He looked at her, his face a kaleidoscope of emotions, shock, anger, confusion, and something else, a flicker of recognition, a yearning he couldn't explain. "He lied to you," Josephine continued, her voice gaining strength. "He stole you from me, but I'm here now, and I'm going to make things right." Billy hesitated, then slowly met her gaze. He saw the truth in her eyes, the pain, the love. He looked back at Thorn, the man who had raised him, the man who had lied to him his entire life. The choice was clear. He stepped towards Josephine, a tentative alliance forming in the ruins of his shattered world. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice still trembling but with a newfound resolve. Thorn drew his gun, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent saloon. The townsfolk scattered, fear etched on their faces. This was the moment redemption had been dreading, the inevitable clash between the woman who dared to challenge Thorn and the man who ruled them with an iron fist. "You made a mistake coming here, Josephine," Thorn snarled, his eyes fixed on her. "A fatal one." Josephine drew her own weapon, her movements swift and practiced. She positioned herself between Thorn and Billy, shielding her son. "He's not yours to control anymore, Thorn," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Billy, though shaken, stood his ground, drawing his own gun. He aimed it at Thorn, his hand trembling but his gaze firm. He was no longer the naive deputy, but a man facing his past, fighting for his future. The air crackled with tension. A showdown was inevitable. The gunfight was brief, brutal. Thorn was fast, experienced, but Josephine was fueled by years of suppressed rage and a mother's unwavering determination. Billy, despite his inexperience, fought with a ferocity born of betrayal and a desperate need to protect the woman who had just entered his life. A bullet whizzed past Josephine's ear. She returned fire, hitting Thorn in the shoulder. He stumbled, momentarily distracted. Billy seized the opportunity, firing a shot that struck Thorne in the chest. Thorne gasped, his eyes widening in disbelief. He staggered backward, collapsing onto the dusty floor. The reign of terror was over. Silence descended upon the saloon, broken only by the ragged breaths of Josephine and Billy. Thorne was defeated, his lifeblood staining the floor of the town he had controlled for so long. Redemption had finally come to redemption. The townsfolk slowly emerged from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of relief and apprehension. They were free from Thorne's tyranny, but uncertain about what the future held. Billy, despite his newfound freedom, looked lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. His entire life had been upended in a single day. Josephine placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a silent reassurance. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with questions and adjustments. They were strangers, bound by blood but separated by years of lies and deceit. Building a relationship wouldn't be easy, but it was a challenge she was willing to face. The townsfolk would need time to rebuild, to heal. And Billy, he would need time to grieve the father he thought he knew and to embrace the mother he had just discovered. Their future was uncertain, but they had each other, and that was a start. The next morning, as the sun rose over redemption, Josephine and Billy stood at the edge of town, Betsy saddled and ready. They had decided to leave, to find a place where they could start over, away from the shadows of Thorne's lies. "Are you ready?" Josephine asked, her eyes searching Billy's. He nodded, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "As I'll ever be." They rode out of redemption, leaving behind the dust and the secrets, heading towards an uncertain horizon. The past would always be a part of them, but they wouldn't let it define them. They would build a new life, brick by brick, on a foundation of truth and love. It wouldn't be easy, but they had each other. And that was all that mattered. The possibility of a new beginning beckoned. They had a long ride ahead of them. As they rode, Josephine glanced at Billy, his young face etched with a mixture of hope and lingering sadness. She knew the scars of the past would never fully disappear, but she also knew that love and truth could heal even the deepest wounds. Revenge had brought her to redemption, but it was love that had given her a future. She had faced her demons, confronted her past, and reclaimed what was rightfully hers. But the true victory wasn't Thorne's death, it was the possibility of a new life with her son. She had lost 15 years, years she could never get back, but she wouldn't waste another moment dwelling on the past. She would focus on the present, on building a future with Billy, a future filled with love, honesty, and the enduring strength of a mother's bond. The cost of revenge had been high, but the reward, a second chance at motherhood, was priceless.